Sarah Mitchell had always been the odd one out in her group of college friends. While they preferred shopping malls and coffee shops, she craved the wilderness. Her hiking boots were worn from countless trails, and her backpack bore patches from national parks across the country. So when her friends Jake, Emma, and Trevor finally agreed to join her for what they called a simple mountain hike, she was thrilled beyond words. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Mount Sterling in Colorado offered what the guidebooks described as a moderate trail with stunning views. Sarah had researched every detail, from weather patterns to emergency exits. She packed extra supplies, checked her gear twice, and even brought backup equipment for her friends who were borrowing most of their hiking gear from a local outdoor shop. That Friday morning in late September, the four friends piled into Jake's SUV, laughing and joking about their upcoming adventure. Sarah noticed her friends seemed more interested in taking photos for social media than actually preparing for the hike, but she pushed down her concerns. Maybe this trip would convert them into fellow nature lovers. The trailhead parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived at dawn. A few serious-looking climbers were loading heavy packs, but most weekend hikers hadn't arrived yet. Sarah felt a familiar excitement as she breathed in the crisp mountain air and adjusted her pack straps. The others complained about the early hour and cold temperature, but they followed her toward the trail marker. For the first 2 hours, everything went perfectly. The trail wound gently upward through dense forest, and her friends seemed to be enjoying themselves. Emma took dozens of photos of wildflowers, while Trevor and Jake competed to see who could spot more wildlife. Sarah felt vindicated in her choice of location and companions. As they climbed higher, however, the dynamics began to shift. The trail became steeper and rockier, requiring more concentration and physical effort. Jake started complaining about his borrowed boots giving him blisters. Emma's enthusiasm for photography waned as she struggled with the altitude. Trevor, who had bragged about his gym workouts, found himself winded and falling behind. Sarah tried to keep everyone motivated, sharing stories about previous hikes and pointing out interesting geological formations. She offered to redistribute some of their gear to lighten their loads, but her suggestions were met with increasing irritation. The group's initial excitement was rapidly being replaced by fatigue and frustration. By the time they reached the halfway point, the complaints had become constant. Jake accused Sarah of misleading them about the difficulty level. Emma blamed her new hiking boots for multiple hot spots on her feet. Trevor sulked silently, saving his energy for walking rather than talking. Sarah found herself caught between pushing forward to reach their planned destination and turning back to keep everyone happy. The weather, which had started clear and sunny, began to change as afternoon approached. Clouds gathered around the higher peaks, and the wind picked up significantly. Sarah checked her weather app and saw a storm system moving in faster than predicted. She knew they needed to either reach the summit quickly or start heading back down immediately. When she shared this information with her friends, their reactions were swift and decisive. Jake declared he was done hiking upward and wanted to head back to the car. Emma agreed, complaining that her feet hurt too much to continue. Trevor said nothing but started walking back down the trail without waiting for group consensus. Sarah felt torn between her desire to reach the summit and her responsibility to stick with her friends. She had been looking forward to this particular peak for months, and the weather window might not open again before winter set in. But she also understood that her friends were genuinely struggling and probably not equipped to handle worsening conditions. After a brief discussion that became increasingly heated, they reached what seemed like a compromise. Her friends would wait for her at a scenic overlook about 30 minutes back down the trail, while Sarah made a quick summit attempt alone. She estimated she could reach the top and return to meet them within 2 hours, well before any serious weather arrived. Sarah should have recognized the warning signs in her friend's behavior, but she was too focused on her goal to pay proper attention. Their complaints had shifted from general discomfort to specific blame directed at her for bringing them on what they now called a death march. Their body language had changed from tired but willing to closed off and resentful. She handed over most of her extra supplies to lighten her pack for the solo summit push, keeping only essential items for the quick round trip. Her friends seemed relieved to finally be stopping, and they assured her they would wait at the overlook and enjoy the views while she finished the climb alone. The next hour of hiking was everything Sarah had hoped for. Without the constant complaints and slow pace, she could properly enjoy the wilderness experience she had been craving. The trail became more challenging as she gained elevation, requiring scrambling over rock formations and careful navigation around loose scree fields. As she climbed higher, the views became increasingly spectacular. Rolling mountains stretched to the horizon in every direction, painted in autumn colors that seemed almost impossibly vibrant. The physical challenge felt invigorating rather than exhausting, and she found herself understanding once again why she was drawn to these wild places. The summit, when she finally reached it, was everything she had imagined and more. Standing alone on the rocky peak, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment and connection with the natural world. She took a few photos, signed the summit register, and enjoyed a well-deserved snack while taking in the panoramic views. But her celebration was brief. Dark clouds were building faster than she had anticipated, and she could see lightning in the distance. The wind had picked up considerably, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. She needed to get back to her friends and start the descent to safer elevation as quickly as possible. The hike back down to the overlook took longer than expected due to increasingly difficult conditions. Wind gusts made balance challenging on the exposed sections, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. Sarah moved as quickly as she safely could, eager to rejoin her group and begin the retreat to the trailhead. When she finally reached the overlook where they had agreed to meet, her heart sank. The scenic viewpoint was completely empty. She called out their names, thinking they might have taken shelter behind some nearby rocks, but heard no response except the echo of her own voice and the growing sound of wind through the trees. Sarah checked her phone and discovered she had no signal at this elevation. She searched the immediate area for any sign of her friends or a note explaining their whereabouts, but found nothing. The overlook showed no evidence that anyone had been there recently, despite the fact that it was the clearly designated meeting spot they had all agreed upon. As the reality of her situation began to sink in, Sarah felt the first real tendrils of fear creeping into her consciousness. She was alone on a mountain, with a storm approaching, and her transportation back to civilization had apparently abandoned her. The friends she had trusted to wait for her had simply vanished, leaving her stranded miles from the nearest road with darkness and dangerous weather rapidly approaching. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each passing minute. Sarah knew she had very limited time to make critical decisions about her survival. She could try to catch up with her friends by rushing down the trail, but that would mean traveling too fast in increasingly dangerous conditions. Alternatively, she could find immediate shelter and wait out the storm, but that would mean spending a night on the mountain with limited supplies. Standing alone on that windswept overlook, with the first drops of rain turning to sleet, Sarah realized that her wonderful day of hiking had just become a fight for survival. Her friends, who she had trusted with her life, had left her stranded in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The mountain that had seemed so beautiful and welcoming just hours earlier was now revealing its deadly potential. The storm was about to begin in earnest, and Sarah Mitchell was completely on her own. The storm hit Mount Sterling with a fury that transformed the mountain from a scenic hiking destination into a deadly trap within minutes. Sarah huddled behind a cluster of granite boulders near the overlook, trying to shield herself from wind gusts that threatened to knock her off the narrow ledge. The temperature had plummeted nearly 20 degrees, and what started as rain quickly turned to driving sleet that stung her exposed skin like thousands of tiny needles. Her first priority was finding better shelter before hypothermia became a real threat. The borrowed emergency bivvy she had packed was designed for unexpected overnight stays, but not for riding out a major storm. She needed to find a more substantial windbreak, preferably something that would protect her from the worst of the weather while keeping her relatively dry. Moving carefully in the deteriorating conditions, Sarah explored the immediate area around the overlook. The terrain was treacherous even in good weather, with loose rocks and steep drop-offs that were now made even more dangerous by the slick conditions. She finally located a shallow cave formed by several large boulders that had fallen together, creating a space just large enough for one person. The shelter was far from perfect, but it offered protection from the wind and most of the precipitation. Sarah crawled inside and immediately began implementing the survival strategies she had learned during wilderness safety courses. She changed into dry clothes from her pack, set up her emergency bivvy, and rationed her remaining food and water to last through what could be a long night. As darkness fell, the storm intensified beyond anything Sarah had experienced in years of mountain hiking. Lightning strikes illuminated the peaks around her with frightening frequency, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very rock she was sheltering against. The wind howled through the narrow passages between boulders, creating an otherworldly symphony that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Sarah's immediate physical survival was only part of her problem. The emotional impact of being abandoned by people she trusted was perhaps even more devastating than the storm itself. She replayed the events of the day over and over, trying to understand how her friends could have simply left without any attempt to communicate their plans or ensure her safety. Had they panicked when the weather started changing and fled down the mountain without thinking clearly? Were they so angry about the difficulty of the hike that they deliberately abandoned her as some form of revenge? Or had something happened to them that prevented them from waiting as promised? Each possibility seemed equally horrible in its own way. Throughout that long, terrifying night, Sarah managed only brief periods of fitful sleep. Every sound made her wonder if it might be a rescue team, while every lightning flash briefly illuminated her surroundings and reminded her how alone and vulnerable she truly was. The cold seeped through every layer of clothing she wore, despite her best efforts to stay warm and dry. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed but left behind a dramatically changed landscape. Fresh snow covered everything above the treeline, and the familiar trail markers were now hidden beneath a white blanket that made navigation exponentially more difficult. The temperature remained well below freezing, and Sarah knew she needed to start moving to generate body heat and begin working her way toward safety. Her plan was straightforward but dangerous. She would follow the trail back down the mountain as carefully as possible, hoping to either encounter other hikers or reach the trailhead where she could get help. The alternative of staying put and hoping for rescue seemed even riskier, since nobody knew exactly where she was or that she needed assistance. The descent began as a slow, careful process of finding footing on snow-covered rocks and identifying trail markers that were now partially obscured. Sarah used her hiking poles to probe for stable ground and test the depth of snowdrifts before committing her full weight to each step. Progress was maddeningly slow, but she knew that a single mistake could result in a fall that would end her chances of self-rescue. After several hours of painstaking progress, Sarah heard something that made her heart leap with hope. Voices were echoing up from somewhere below her position on the mountain. She called out as loudly as she could, hoping to attract attention and signal her location to what she assumed were other hikers or possibly a search party. The voices grew closer, and she could make out what sounded like coordinated movement through the forest below. But these didn't sound like casual hikers or even typical rescue personnel. The communication was crisp and professional, with a military precision that suggested specialized training and experience. When the first figure emerged from the treeline below her position, Sarah understood immediately that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The man climbing toward her was dressed in military fatigues but carried no visible climbing equipment. No ropes, no harnesses, no specialized mountaineering gear of any kind. Yet he moved up the steep, snow-covered terrain with a confidence and skill that seemed almost superhuman. Behind him came 5 more soldiers, each moving with the same impossible grace and efficiency across terrain that had challenged Sarah even in good weather conditions. They weren't just climbing the mountain, they were flowing up it like water, finding the path of least resistance, using techniques and abilities that defied everything she thought she knew about mountain travel. The lead soldier reached her position within minutes, covering ground that had taken Sarah hours to traverse. He was young, probably in his 20s, with the lean build and intense focus that she associated with elite athletes. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. His first questions were exactly what she would have expected from a professional rescuer. Was she injured? How long had she been stranded? Did she have adequate food and water? But Sarah found herself struggling to answer coherently, not because of her ordeal, but because she was trying to process what she was witnessing. The other 5 soldiers had spread out around the area and were conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of the terrain. But they were doing it without any of the equipment she would have expected. No GPS units, no radio communication with base camps, no safety ropes connecting them to secure anchor points. They were operating in dangerous mountain terrain with the same casual efficiency most people would display walking through a city park. When Sarah asked how they had known she was in trouble, the lead soldier's answer was both reassuring and puzzling. He explained that they were conducting routine training exercises in the area and had been monitoring weather conditions and potential rescue situations. The storm had triggered protocols for sweeping the mountain for stranded hikers, and her calls for help had guided them to her location. But something about his explanation didn't quite add up. Sarah had been on this mountain many times and had never encountered military training exercises. The nearest military installation was hundreds of miles away, and she couldn't imagine any standard training program that would involve climbing in such extreme conditions without proper equipment. As the soldiers prepared to escort her down the mountain, Sarah got a closer look at their capabilities. They moved across terrain that should have required ropes and anchors as if it were level ground. They communicated through subtle hand signals that suggested years of specialized training together. Most remarkably, they seemed completely unaffected by the altitude, cold, and difficult conditions that had pushed her to her absolute limits. The descent that Sarah had been dreading became almost effortless with her military escorts. They had identified the safest route down the mountain and established a system for ensuring her safety that was both efficient and foolproof. One soldier stayed directly behind her to provide assistance if she slipped, while another moved ahead to scout for obstacles and hazards. Their pace was significantly faster than anything Sarah could have managed alone, but somehow they made it feel completely manageable. When she struggled with a particularly difficult section, strong hands would appear to provide exactly the support she needed. When she needed to rest, they would call for breaks before she even realized she was becoming tired. As they descended through the treeline and the trailhead came into view, Sarah found herself grappling with questions that went far beyond her immediate rescue. Who were these soldiers, and what kind of training program produced capabilities like she had witnessed? How had they happened to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to find her? And why did their presence on the mountain feel like something much more significant than a routine training exercise? The parking lot, when they finally reached it, was nearly empty except for a few vehicles that Sarah didn't recognize. Her friend's SUV was nowhere to be seen, confirming that they had indeed abandoned her on the mountain. The emotional impact of that realization, combined with exhaustion from her ordeal, finally overwhelmed her self-control. As she sat on a bench near the trailhead, trying to process everything that had happened, Sarah watched her rescuers with growing fascination. They moved with the same precise coordination in the parking lot that they had demonstrated on the mountain, but now she could observe them more carefully and begin to understand the true extent of their remarkable abilities. The lead soldier, who had introduced himself only as Sergeant Martinez, approached Sarah as she sat trying to process the surreal nature of her rescue. His expression had shifted from the focused intensity of someone managing an emergency to something closer to genuine concern for her well-being. He handed her a thermos of hot coffee that seemed to materialize from nowhere, since she hadn't seen any of the soldiers carrying traditional backpacks or supply bags. As Sarah gratefully accepted the warm drink, she mustered the courage to ask the questions that had been building throughout their descent. How had they managed to climb so efficiently without any visible equipment? What kind of training program prepared soldiers for that level of mountain expertise? And, most importantly, who were they really? Sergeant Martinez studied her face for a long moment before responding, as if weighing how much information he should share. When he finally spoke, his explanation was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. They were indeed Army Rangers, but from a specialized unit that most people would never hear about. Their training focused on rapid deployment in extreme environments where traditional equipment and support systems weren't available or practical. The techniques Sarah had witnessed weren't standard military procedures taught to regular soldiers. This unit spent years developing methods for operating in hostile terrain using nothing but their physical abilities and tactical knowledge. They practiced climbing techniques that emphasized speed and efficiency over safety margins that civilian climbers required. Every movement was calculated to minimize energy expenditure while maximizing progress across difficult ground. But Martinez's explanation raised even more questions than it answered. Why would the military need soldiers who could operate like human mountain goats? What situations would require climbing skills that prioritized speed over traditional safety protocols? And why were they conducting exercises in civilian recreation areas where their activities might be witnessed by ordinary hikers? The answers, when they came, painted a picture of modern military operations that most Americans never considered. In an era of global conflict and uncertain threats, elite units needed capabilities that went far beyond traditional battlefield skills. They might need to infiltrate mountainous regions where helicopter insertion was impossible. They might need to conduct reconnaissance in terrain that couldn't support mechanized equipment. Or they might need to extract personnel from locations where conventional rescue operations would fail. Sarah realized she was getting a glimpse into military capabilities that were probably classified at levels far above what civilians typically learned about. These soldiers represented investments of time, money, and training resources that most people couldn't begin to imagine. Each man had spent years developing skills that pushed the boundaries of human physical and mental performance. As if reading her thoughts, Martinez offered additional details that made the scope of their training even more impressive. They regularly practiced operations at altitudes that would incapacitate most people. They could function effectively in temperature extremes that would kill untrained individuals within hours. They had memorized topographical details of mountain ranges around the world and could navigate complex terrain without any electronic assistance. The coffee was working its magic, warming Sarah from the inside and helping her think more clearly about her situation. But, instead of feeling more secure now that she was safe, she found herself increasingly unsettled by the implications of what she had witnessed. If the military possessed these kinds of capabilities, what other specialized units existed that ordinary citizens knew nothing about? Martinez seemed to sense her discomfort and shifted the conversation back to practical matters. They needed to contact local authorities to report her abandonment and ensure that proper reports were filed about the incident. They also needed to arrange transportation for her since her original ride had disappeared along with her faithless friends. But, first, he wanted to understand exactly what had happened that led to her being stranded on the mountain. Sarah found herself telling the entire story, from the initial planning stages through the moment she discovered her friends had vanished from their agreed meeting point. As she talked, she noticed the other soldiers listening with professional attention, as if they were gathering intelligence about potential threats or security concerns. Their questions revealed a level of tactical thinking that surprised her. They wanted to know about her friends' backgrounds and motivations. Had any of them shown signs of planning to abandon her before the actual incident? Were there relationships or conflicts within the group that might have influenced their decision-making? Did she believe their abandonment was intentional malice or panic-driven poor judgment? Sarah realized these soldiers were analyzing her friend's behavior through the lens of military training that emphasized understanding human nature under stress. They were trying to determine whether her abandonment represented a criminal act that required investigation or simply civilian incompetence in crisis situations. The distinction apparently mattered for how they would report the incident to appropriate authorities. As they talked, Sarah became aware that other hikers were beginning to arrive in the parking lot for what would normally be a busy weekend morning on the trails. But something strange was happening with their interactions. People seemed to notice the soldiers but, then, quickly looked away and avoided coming too close to their group. It was as if ordinary civilians instinctively recognized that they were in the presence of something beyond their normal experience. The soldiers themselves seemed completely oblivious to the attention they were attracting, or perhaps they were simply accustomed to that kind of reaction from civilians. They continued their conversation with Sarah while maintaining an alertness to their surroundings that suggested constant situational awareness was simply their normal state of being. When a park ranger arrived to check on reports of overnight hikers caught in the storm, his interaction with the soldiers confirmed Sarah's growing suspicions about their special status. The ranger clearly recognized them and treated them with a deference that went beyond simple respect for military service. He asked no questions about their presence or activities, and seemed eager to conclude his business with them as quickly as possible. Martinez explained to the ranger that they had encountered a stranded civilian during their training exercise and had provided assistance according to standard protocols. But the ranger's response suggested this wasn't the first time these particular soldiers had been involved in civilian rescue operations in the area. There were apparently established procedures for handling such situations that kept everyone's involvement quiet and unofficial. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself caught between gratitude for her rescue and growing concern about the implications of what she had experienced. These soldiers represented capabilities that seemed almost superhuman, yet they operated in secret even during training exercises in public areas. They had saved her life, but they were also clearly involved in activities that most Americans would never learn about. The transportation Martinez had promised arrived in the form of an unmarked military vehicle that looked nothing like the standard Humvees or trucks most people associated with army operations. The driver was clearly another member of their unit, though he hadn't been part of the mountain rescue team. When Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, she noticed equipment and communication systems that were far more sophisticated than anything she had seen in civilian vehicles. During the drive back toward civilization, Martinez continued answering her questions with a patience that suggested he understood her need to process what had happened. But his responses also made it clear that there were limits to what he could share. Some aspects of their training and capabilities were classified at levels that prevented discussion with civilians under any circumstances. As they reached the outskirts of the nearest town, Sarah realized that her mountain adventure had become something much more significant than a simple hiking trip gone wrong. She had been rescued by soldiers whose abilities challenged everything she thought she knew about human limitations. She had glimpsed military capabilities that most Americans never suspected existed. And she had learned that elite units operated in secret even within her own country's borders. The soldiers delivered her safely to a local hospital for evaluation, despite her insistence that she was physically fine. Martinez explained that protocol required medical assessment after any exposure incident, though he didn't elaborate on what other situations might qualify as exposure incidents. As they parted ways, he handed her a business card with only a phone number and advised her to call if she ever needed to discuss what had happened. Standing in the hospital parking lot, watching the unmarked military vehicle disappear down the highway, Sarah understood that her life had been forever changed by more than just being abandoned on a mountain. She had witnessed capabilities that revealed how much about her own country's military operations remained hidden from ordinary citizens. The soldiers who had saved her represented a level of training and ability that pushed the boundaries of human potential. Her friends, when they eventually contacted her with weak excuses and hollow apologies, seemed like children playing at outdoor adventure compared to the professionals who had conducted her rescue. They had fled at the first sign of serious weather, abandoning someone they claimed to care about because their own comfort and safety mattered more than honoring their commitments. But the Army Rangers who found her had risked their own safety to climb a dangerous mountain in terrible conditions, using nothing but their training and determination to reach someone in need. They had demonstrated what human beings could accomplish when they dedicated themselves completely to excellence and service to others. Sarah would never forget the lesson, and she would never again take for granted the extraordinary people who stood ready to help when ordinary citizens found themselves in situations beyond their capabilities to handle alone.